In the last lecture, we learned how it was that Britain and her allies defeated France in the War of the Spanish Succession, and how Britain in particular established the 18th century Atlantic system, a worldwide commercial empire, took over a slave trade previously dominated by the Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch, and so built their prosperity on a legacy of human misery, the consequences of which will reach into our own times. Whatever the long-term legacy for the peoples of Europe, America, and Africa from the Atlantic system, the short-term legacy was prosperity and peace in Europe itself, a peace which lasted almost 2 decades. Why? Mainly because France was neutralized. France emerged from a century of warfare, as Spain had done earlier, exhausted financially and militarily. Louis XIV died in September 1715 after a reign of 73 years. On his deathbed, he urged his successor, "My child, you're going to be a great king. Do not imitate me in my liking for buildings and for wars. On the contrary, do try to have peace with your neighbors. Give to God what you owe him. Always follow good advice. Do try to relieve the suffering of your people, which I am most distressed at not having been able to do." Now, if you think about it, that comes pretty close to repudiating the whole program of absolutism that Louis had established. An even greater irony is that after so much strife and expenditure, he left France in 1715 almost exactly where he had found it, financially and militarily exhausted from decades of war, its nobility grumbling at their lack of power, its people groaning at taxes which had driven many of them into poverty, and its crown worn by a little boy. Among the many setbacks that Louis XIV faced in his later years were the deaths in swift succession of, first, in April 1711, his son, Louis the Grand Dauphin, died suddenly. In February 1712, his son, the Duke of Burgundy, and his beloved wife, Marie Adelaide of Savoy, contracted smallpox or measles, we're not sure which, and died, a reminder that epidemic disease was no respecter of royalty. Within a week of the Duke of Burgundy's death, his 2 children had caught the virus. The eldest son, the Duke of Brittany, was bled repeatedly by doctors and died on March 8, 1712. His younger brother, Prince Louis, was saved by his governess, the Madame du Ventador, who forbade doctors to bleed the young boy and personally looked after him during his illness. Finally, another potential heir, the Duke of Berry, died in 1714. So all of Louis's grandchildren were dead, but Philip V of Spain, who could not, by the Treaty of Utrecht, succeed to the throne of France. Now, British Whigs thought that he might try, but remember, neither France nor Spain was in any position to fight again in 1715. So the War of the Spanish Succession and the British Succession also turned out to be the war that settled the French succession as well. It would be another Louis. And so it was that Louis's great-grandson, a child of 5, succeeded the Sun King as Louis XV. The poor kid was constantly reminded of the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. It's a wonder he didn't die of the pressure. Now, practically and inevitably, the boy king could not rule in his own right. This was a chance for the old aristocratic families of France who'd been kept down at Versailles by Louis XIV to make the comeback. By 1715, lots of people in French society were thoroughly sick of Louis XIV's brand of absolutism. Archbishop Fenelon, one of Louis XV's tutors, attacked, quote, "the steady stream of extravagant adulation, which reaches the point of idolatry, and that had brought France a succession of bloody wars and misery to her people." From henceforward, the nation was to be run by a regency council. Now, Louis XIV had designated his illegitimate son, the Duc de Maine, as regent. But Louis's nephew, Philippe, Duc d'Orléans, worked out a deal with the Parlement of Paris. They would proclaim him regent. He would restore to them the right to veto royal acts that Louis XIV had taken away. He also declared that the court at Versailles was disbanded, and he moved the capital back to Paris. So again, Louis XIV's great work is dismantled. In some ways, the Orleanist Regency was the revenge of the French aristocracy. One of the first things he did was to establish the Polysynody, a set of 8 councils staffed by the ancient aristocracy, what was called the nobility of the sword, to run the kingdom. They would run the kingdom instead of the king himself, the way Louis had done, Louis XIV, and also instead of the newly created aristocracy of the robe, that is, civil servants. Well, the Polycynody fell apart because the ancient aristocracy proved to be lazy and incompetent, but when they were replaced by the old ministries again, the great offices of state were still bestowed on the great aristocrats, not on bankers or merchants or lawyers, men like Colbert. Orléans also worked out an alliance with the British against Philip V, should he try for the crown, so strange bedfellows there. But he failed to solve the problem of royal finance. Now, Orléans was aware of the financial revolution. He knew what the British were doing, and he wanted one for France. So he embraced the scheme of a Scottish speculator named John Law. Now, Law was a gambler and a fugitive from English justice. He killed a man in a duel. He published on finance, arguing that money had no value in itself. It was merely a means of exchange. In 1719, Orléans joined with Law to establish the Mississippi Company for investment in the French territory of Louisiana, and the Banque Royale to issue notes and stock. There ensued a rash of speculation which became known as the Mississippi Bubble. People knew that they could make lots and lots of money by playing the market. What they didn't know is that the stock actually had to be backed up with something, actual trade. Shares skyrocketed. Shares that were worth 500 livres in 1719 were worth 15,000 by 1720. And then the stocks crashed, losing 97% of their value in 1721. Lots of investors were ruined. Law was dismissed and fled France. French government finances were discredited. France would have no paper money and no state bank until Napoleon, almost a century later. Orléans died in 1723. He was succeeded by the Duc de Berry. His minister was marked by high taxes and grain prices, a bellicose foreign policy that France couldn't afford, and his dismissal in 1727. He was replaced by the wise old André Hercule Cardinal Fleury. Fleury was already in his 70s when he came to power. He had been appointed one of Louis's tutors by Louis XIV. Fleury saw that the king and France needed peace, to give the king time to grow up and to give France's rickety finances a chance to recover. So he maintained the new British alliance. He avoided confronting the nobility on the sensitive issue of taxation, but he encouraged trade and he stabilized the currency. He even managed to balance the French budget in 1738. Louis XV himself spent the first 33 years of his life in amusement. He was lazy. He wasn't terribly interested in government. He was dominated by mistresses and nobles. In later years, he had famous affairs with the Madame du Pompadour, who really did exercise political influence on him after Fleury's death in 1743. Also famously, the former prostitute Madame du Barry, who wasn't that interested in politics, and lots of other women at the French court. Louis, of course, is famous for saying, "Après moi, la déluge," after me, the flood. A moment of prescience for Louis XV. Now, fortunately for France, Louis and Fleury had English counterparts who thought almost exactly the same way in Britain. Let's look at the political situation in Britain. In 1714, Queen Anne died. Now, it turns out that there were lots of potential heirs for the throne who were Catholic, but Parliament had determined by the Act of Settlement of 1701 that a Catholic would never again reign in England. Remember James II? Remember how that had worked out? So over the objections of the Jacobites who wanted James II's son, Prince James, the crown passed immediately to the next Protestant heir to the throne, a descendant of James I who was an English or Scottish or Irish or Welsh. He was George, Elector of Hanover, a German principality in the Holy Roman Empire. He became King George, later known as George I, and he ruled from 1714 to 1727. Now, unlike Louis XV, George was rather elderly by contemporary standards. He was 54 years old. He was a soldier. He'd spent all of his time on the continent. He spoke German and French, but no English. He was estranged from his wife, but he kept a number of mistresses. He wasn't all that interested, in fact, in running his British dominions. He was more interested in the mistresses. He was content, therefore, to be a constitutional monarch. Sometimes constitutionalism grows because of a sort of vacuum at the top. He left government in the hands of a chief minister, of the Whig Party, which had always supported a Protestant succession, and of Parliament. He died in 1727 and was succeeded by a son, George II, who was really very similar. He spoke German-accented English as well as German. He was also a military man. He was happily married to Queen Caroline, but one of the reasons for that happiness is she apparently tolerated his mistresses. You're noticing a pattern here in the family. He was content to leave most of the business of government to his father's chief minister. So who was this famous chief minister who was the real power in England? Sir Robert Walpole served as head of the British Treasury and in effect prime minister from 1720 to 1742. This is still a British record. How did he do it? First, he controlled all the reins of patronage. If you wanted a title, lands, a job in Britain's expanding bureaucracy, in the church, in the army, the navy, for yourself or a relative, you came to Walpole. If you voted against him in Parliament, if you disagreed with or obstructed his policies in the countryside, you were instantly consigned to the political wilderness. You were unable to assist your friends or help yourself. In other words, Walpole ran a strict spoils system. This gave him a solid core of MPs and peers in Parliament. In fact, they were known as the Old Corps. But they were never enough to secure a majority, which meant that Walpole also had to convince the country that he was the right man for the job on the issues. Now, on issues, like a modern politician watching the polls, Walpole picked and chose from whichever Whig or Tory position was the most popular. On the succession, he was staunch against the Jacobites. He would keep the Hanoverians on the throne, and that's what most people wanted. On religion, he defended the status quo. That is, he defended the privileges of the Anglican Church. He defended the toleration of other Protestant sects that had been enacted in 1689, but he wasn't about to extend that toleration to Catholics or to lift penalties on Puritans, which made it harder for them to hold office or attend university. Above all, the most important plank in Walpole's program was that he pursued peace in Europe. That kept taxes low and his popularity high. Now, he wasn't entirely cynical about this. He also hated war personally. Walpole had been Queen Anne's Secretary of War, and supposedly he remembered the bodies being unloaded at British ports during the War of the Spanish Succession. He wanted no part of that. This combination kept Walpole in power and popular with the electorate, and so popular with the king. In effect, Walpole made Britain, for a while, a stable one-party state. And so, after 2 centuries of war and revolution, a period of relative calm, stability, and prosperity ensued in England, built, you'll remember, on the Atlantic system. This contributed to peace in Europe in partnership with France. But all good things must come to an end. As Walpole and Fleury entered their second decade of power in the 1730s, there were signs that the European situation was heating up. Now, thanks to the Atlantic, in a way, one of the reasons for this is the Atlantic system and the Indian trade, because the economies of all Western European countries were now growing again. They'd fully recovered from the wars of Louis XIV, so people had money. A new generation of rulers was growing up in Europe who didn't remember those wars. What they remembered was how everybody used to respect the Sun King. The resulting conflicts would be true world wars, fought on the plains of Europe, but also in the forests of North America, the varied terrain of India, on the high seas, all for more empire and its consequence, trade. Now, the preliminaries didn't begin on the high seas. They began in 1733, when France and Spain joined against Russia and Austria in a squabble over the Polish throne. Now, we've given pretty short shrift to Poland-Lithuania in these lectures. It was once a great power in the east center of Europe. But centuries of warfare had elevated the status of local aristocrats, which meant that the monarch was weak. The 1572 Constitution confirmed that the aristocrats could elect him. And of course, if you're elected, you have to campaign and you have to make concessions to the people who voted for you. The Polish king was saddled with a 2-chamber diet, the Sejm, whose legislation could be derailed by just one vote of one aristocrat, the liberum veto. In other words, for anything to pass the Sejm, it had to be unanimous. Can you imagine? Local nobles and gentry, the Szlachta, were allowed to form military confederations. They were given such great autonomy in the countryside that they were virtual warlords in their own districts. And they had absolute power over their serfs, which meant that the serfs hated them and were happy to support any invasion attempt any rebellion from any rival power. Without a strong central coordinating authority, Poland-Lithuania was easy prey to its powerful neighbors: Russia, Sweden, Brandenburg, Prussia, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans. Now, there was a brief revival of Polish power under Jan Sobieski between 1674 and 96. It was his cavalry, you'll remember, that saved Vienna from the Turks in 1683. But he could not break noble power, and consequently, subsequent Polish kings were virtual Russian puppets. Now, in 1733, it was time again to choose another Polish king. Russia and Austria support Augustus III, who's also the Elector of Saxony. France and most of the Polish nobility supported a descendant of Jan Sobieski, whose daughter was married to Louis XV, named Stanisław Leszczynski. Now, this led to the War of the Polish Succession, 1733 to 35. Russia invaded and drove Stanisław out. In retaliation, France declared war and got involved. They were eventually joined by Spain and Sardinia, who don't care who sits on the Polish throne. They just want Italian territory, and they see this as a chance to get it. The eventual Treaty of Vienna of 1735 settled matters by shuffling crowns around like poker chips. Augustus III kept Poland for Russia. Stanisław needs something, so he gets to be Duke of Lorraine, but there's already a Duke of Lorraine, so Francis Stephen, Duke of Lorraine, gets to become the Grand Duke of Tuscany. Spain got Naples and Sicily. Now, these events were preliminary to partitions of Poland, which took place in 1772, 1793, and 1797. In those years, Russia, Prussia, and Austria carved up increasing amounts of Poland until, by the last of those dates, by the end of the 18th century, Poland had ceased to exist. Another war that took place at this time in 1739 to 42 was one between the British and Spanish over trading rights. British merchants had protested seizure by Spanish guardacostas. One Captain Jenkins actually went to Parliament and, to demonstrate his mistreatment, brought his severed ear in a box, which explains why the war became known as the War of Jenkins' Ear among the general populace. When the only war that I know of that has ever been fought over an ear, by the way, when the war went badly, Walpole fell. But it was the War of the Austrian Succession that was the first really big showdown since Utrecht. In 1740, the royal family of Austria faced a succession crisis. The Emperor Charles VI had continued his father Leopold's policies of de-emphasizing rule as Holy Roman Emperor, consolidating his ancestral Habsburg, Austrian and Hungarian holdings. But he had failed to produce a male heir. His only child was Maria Theresa. Now, in 1713, the emperor issued the Pragmatic Sanction. This was a document that said that Maria Theresa would indeed succeed to all his Habsburg dominions. And then he went around Europe trying to get the governments of Britain, France, Prussia, Russia, and the Netherlands to sign it, which they did. But would the agreement hold? Now, had this been England or even Sweden, which had all had female rule, there'd be no problem. England in particular had been ruled by Elizabeth I and Queen Anne very effectively. But remember that Austria was an Eastern state. It was Catholic and it was absolutist. It still embraced strict hierarchy, even serfdom. Austria wasn't necessarily ready for female rule. When Charles VI died in 1740, Maria Theresa succeeded. But three other claimants popped up, including our old friend Augustus III, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, and our even older friend Philip V of Spain. Remember him? Well, why not? His grandmother was a Habsburg. Go for it. On top of that, the Prussians took advantage of the distraction to invade the rich farmland of Silesia. Let's talk a little bit about Prussia now. You'll remember that the rulers of Prussia had built it into a small but powerful and efficient state backed by a great army. Frederick William I, the Sergeant King, had doubled the size of the army to 80,000 men, but he had never used it. It was like a great toy that he would bring out occasionally but never actually play with. In 1740, he too died. He was succeeded by his son Frederick II, soon to be known as Frederick the Great. Now, Frederick II, a little bit of psychohistory here, had had a distant and cold relationship with his father, who objected to his artistic temperament. Frederick was a young man who played the flute, he composed, he read Enlightenment philosophes. This didn't set well with the Sergeant King. So psychobiographers have had a field day with Frederick's decision to invade Silesia in 1740. Was he trying to prove something to his dead father? Well, this family squabble plunged Europe into the War of the Austrian Succession. Maria Theresa rallied her people. Addressing the Hungarian Diet, she went to the Hungarian Diet, holding up her children for them to see, begging them to defend the dynasty. France joined Prussia against its traditional enemies, the Habsburgs. What would Britain do? Remember, Britain is now the most powerful country in Europe. Walpole stood for peace, was reluctant to get involved. But many Britons saw Maria Theresa in chivalrous terms. We have to defend this lady. Once Walpole fell, remember he fell because of the War of Jenkins' Ear, which had not gone terribly well, Britain entered the war in 1742. Walpole remarked, "You have your war. I wish you well of it." The War of the Austrian Succession lasted from 1740 to 48. In fact, it was really two nearly separate wars, Austria versus Prussia on the continent over the Austrian succession and Silesian farmland, and Britain versus France at sea, in the colonies and in India over trade and empire. Now at first, Walpole seemed to be vindicated, for things didn't go so well for the Austrians and the British. Frederick rolled over the Austrian army in two campaigns in 1740-42 and 44-45. The French, under Maurice Comte de Saxe, invaded the Austrian Netherlands, defeating the defenders at Fontenoy in 1745 and Raucourt in 1746. France even launched an invasion of Scotland in 1745 to try to place the Stuart pretender, Prince James, remember him, back on the British throne. This romantic escapade began in the summer and fall of 1745, when the pretender's dashing son, Charles Edward Stuart, popularly known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, landed in Scotland, raised the royal standard of the Stuarts, and called on the Catholic Highland clan leaders to raise their tenants. This resulted in an army of peasant farmers who actually managed to defeat an English force at Preston Pass. They took Edinburgh, where a Stuart held court for the first time since the 1680s. This caused mass panic in London. There was no regular army between the Jacobite army and the capital. The whole system of British government credit was on the verge of collapse. But once Charlie invaded England, he found that there wasn't a whole lot of support among his English subjects, or would-be English subjects, for a Catholic absolutist who spoke better French than English. Go figure. In the spring of 1746, Charles Edward began the long, slow retreat north. He was caught by a regular army recalled from Europe under George II's son, William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, who slaughtered the ragtag Jacobites at the Battle of Culloden on April 16, 1746. The aftermath for Highland Scotland was not unlike what happened to Catholic Ireland after the Boyne. Cumberland mercilessly hunted down stragglers, the wounded, ordering them and all prisoners killed. This gave him the nickname the Butcher in Scotland. Subsequent parliamentary legislation broke up the feudal power of the clans, especially their right of military service. The Highlanders were deprived of arms and even forbidden to wear the tartan. As for Bonnie Prince Charlie, he had to hide out in Scotland for 5 months. Despite a price of £30,000 on his head, he managed to do so. He eventually escaped to France incognito, dressed as a lady's maid, and spent the rest of his life dining out on this romantic story. In the meantime, for a while, the only thing keeping Austria afloat was English money. But gradually, the Royal Navy and the British Army won some crucial victories, and that brought the Prussians and the French to the table. The Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle was really a timeout. Both sides went back to their previous borders, except that Prussia got to keep Silesia. And they spent the next few years preparing for round two. Both sides worked overtime on diplomacy between 1748 and 1755. Count Kaunitz, the Austrian foreign minister, was obsessed with getting Silesia back, and he figured that the way to do that was to ally with the French. Now, which means he was switching sides. Now, there's a kind of logic to this. Austria and France are both Catholic, and they're both absolutist. But above all, the Austrians were still impressed with the reputation of Louis XIV. They couldn't get over it. In fact, allying with Austria was a blunder between the French and the Austrians. It drove the Prussians into the arms of the British. Now stop and think about that one. These were both Protestant monarchies. Above all, Prussia had Europe's best army, the British had Europe's best navy and largest bank account. This is a recipe for disaster for the French and the Austrians. And yet, the 7 Years' War actually began very poorly for the British. The first thing to note about the 7 Years' War is it's actually a misnomer. It had actually started well before 1756. The French and the British had been skirmishing along the Ohio River Valley since 1754. The Ohio River Valley was the key to the American interior. The French had been building up alliances with the Iroquois Confederacy. In 1755, the British responded by sending an army of regulars and colonial militia under Edward Braddock to attack Fort Duquesne. Now, everyone who's a baseball fan knows why Fort Duquesne is important. Hint, it sits on the site of modern Pittsburgh, so it's at the juncture of 3 rivers, the Ohio, the Allegheny, and the Monongahela. I refer, of course, to the now-defunct Three Rivers Stadium. Now, Braddock's assault failed, he was killed, and the troops had to be brought back by a young Virginian named George Washington. We'll hear more of him later. But the great game was on. The early years of the 7 Years' War were disastrous for the British and the Prussians. In Europe, Frederick fought a series of seesaw campaigns and won some important battles. For example, Lobositz in 1756, Torgau in 1760. But the siege of Prague failed in 1757, and his subordinates had a distressing tendency to lose. Sweden and Russia joined the war against him, and indeed, by 1760, Berlin had fallen, and Frederick was on the verge of defeat. At sea in 1756, the British raid on Rochefort failed. The French destroyed the British Mediterranean fleet under Admiral Byng and captured Minorca. Byng was court-martialed and shot on the quarterdeck of HMS Monarch for failing to engage the enemy with sufficient aggressiveness. This was satirized in Voltaire's Candide, in which we are informed the British like to shoot an admiral every once in a while in order to encourage all the others. In America, the French captured Fort Oswego, New York, and Fort William Henry. A British expedition to capture Cape Breton Island, north of Nova Scotia, was destroyed by a storm. In India, the French took Calcutta. The British and Prussian war effort was in a shambles. George II reacted by firing his ministry and naming a new prime minister, William Pitt. Now, William Pitt had made a name for himself as a kind of young hothead of the opposition. He made great speeches. But like Winston Churchill 2 centuries later, he proved to be a terrific war minister. His basic strategy was throw money at the problem. And of course, you'll remember the British had lots of money. Pitt raised taxes and borrowed hugely against government credit. He spent this money on an army that grew to 100,000 men, a navy to 70,000 men. Shipyards were expanded, foundries for new cannon established. By the way, this takes place just at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and Britain is ahead there too. He also spent the money keeping the Prussian army alive. He sent subsidies to Prussia. This was crucial because Pitt decided to concentrate British forces in North America and India, leaving the European theater to Frederick. Frederick, by the way, got lucky in 1762. The Empress Elizabeth of Russia, who hated him, died and was succeeded by the pro-Prussian Peter III, who offered peace. But the real turning point of the war had already taken place in 1759, a year that the British referred to as the Annus Mirabilis, the miracle year in which the church bells almost wore out their clappers with celebrating victories. It began with a British and German army defeating the French at Minden. At sea, a French invasion attempt was thwarted by the defeat of the French Mediterranean fleet. In America, the British finally captured Fort Duquesne and renamed it Pittsburgh. So now you know where Pittsburgh comes from. They captured Guadeloupe in the Caribbean. And finally, a British army under General James Wolfe stormed the Plains of Abraham, surprising French General Montcalm, and took Canada, and took Quebec, and with it most of Canada. In India, General Clive took Bengal in 1757, and the British took southern India in 1761. The war was finally settled in 1763 at the Treaty of Paris. If Utrecht is a subtle masterpiece of diplomacy, Paris was a brutal recognition of force. Britain got Canada, all of the American territories to the Mississippi, including Florida, Grenada, Dominica, Tobago, St. Vincent in the West Indies, which of course meant more sugar, Senegal in Africa, an important way station to India, and the removal of East Indian troops from India. Prussia kept Silesia. The French Empire in North America, apart from a few islands off of Canada and in the West Indies, was no more. The promise of Utrecht had been fulfilled at Paris. The longest purse had won an empire. The race, begun by Prince Henry the Navigator, had been won by King George III of England, who came to the throne in 1760. The question now became, could he hold on to the prize?